And welcome. Let's do a quick audio check, video check as well. Okay, I think things are working. Um, it's been a little while and I updated the software on the Stream Deck and it wiped out all my buttons, so I had to reprogram everything. Greetings, Mo. Hello. Come on in, grab a seat, grab a cup of coffee or wine, depending on your time zone. And let's talk about that extra 1%. And to start that off, congratulations to Tanya Henderson. It's been a long journey. Tanya Henderson is now a Business Central MVP in the United States. And if you don't follow her on Twitter, head on over to Twitter and follow Tanya Test Team. Test Team is her Business Central consulting company, so hence the name Tanya Test Team. And this has been a long journey as I worked with her to navigate the administrative hurdles of the MVP nomination process. So this was several years in the making due to various complications. But finally, she has been awarded MVP by Microsoft. So hats off to Tanya. Cheers. So MVP is a relevant topic. What does it take to become an MVP, and how much extra work do you have to do, and how hard is that, and do I really have time? Is that something I want to do? It's like, it's a conversation I've had with people. They're like, no, I that's too hard. That's too much work. And so for some people, it's just not out of the question because they've got way too much going on. For other people, it's like, well, you're already doing this stuff, so why not just apply for the MVP nomination? And so a few weeks ago, I saw this tweet. Someone retweeted it, or it popped into one of my Twitter timelines, and it's this handwritten note: doing nothing at all versus making small, consistent efforts. And it does this little math equation: 1.00 to the power of 365 equals 1.00. 1.01, just 1% effort, to the power of 365, meaning daily, 1% additional effort, takes you to 37.7. And while it may be a contrived math representation of the metaphor, I think it's an interesting concept, and I think it's powerful, and I think the sentiment is valid, shall we say. Whether you agree with the mathematics of it, I think the sentiment makes sense, and it is very similar to the idea of compounding, financial compounding, or compound interest. So if you're familiar with this is a very common, it's almost a meme at this point. It's discussed by financial planners, investment advisors. It's taught in accounting and finance. And the idea is, if you, excuse me, if you invest a small amount of money every year, every month, whatever, over time, the compound interest, if assuming you're earning interest on those savings, those savings will compound over time. And that 5% interest one year gets compounded the next year and the next year. And as long as you're consistently earning interest and not losing that money, excuse me, and as long as you're continuing to contribute to your retirement plan or investment fund or whatever the case is, the theory goes that you will have this curve that really ramps up and grows very rapidly as a result of small, incremental, consistent early efforts. Yes, it may take 20, 30, 40 years, in this case for, say, retirement planning, but eventually it really starts to take off. Well, what if we change that metaphor to effort or learning or whatever you want to call it, and make this a 1% contribution to your learning, your career, your hobbies, whatever the case may be? It doesn't have to be work related. And so anyway, I just saw that in my Twitter feed, and I bookmarked it back in March, and I was like, oh, okay. I appreciate the sentiment. So if we jump ahead later in March, I saw that Jeremy Viska retweeted this, and this is a comic by Safely Endangered. I guess this is a webtoon. And the character says, okay, I've made a list of everything I want to do, and the character's happy. But where do I start? Because it's presumably a long list. Where the heck do I start? And then frustration and fear and concern and overwhelm sets in. And later he's sitting in the corner freaking out like, oh my gosh, this is too big. I can't do this. How do I accomplish things? And Jeremy says this is very much a thing sometimes. Yeah, it's always a thing, really. If you realize the big picture and how big it is and where you're at and what you need to do to get there, it's very, very intimidating. So I replied to him with a phrase that's always stuck in my head. When I was in college many years ago, we had a speaker. We would have speakers come to our campus, and we'd have dinners where they would speak and some great presentations. And one was by a guy, I can't remember his name. It was quite a while ago. And he did a kind of a motivational talk, a presentation based on a trip that he did to Africa. And I don't remember the reason, if it was a fundraiser or some awareness campaign or why he did it, but he went to Africa and he walked across the entire continent, and presumably across the wide part, not the narrow part like at the bottom. But and Africa is a rather large continent. It is massive. And so he walked across Africa, and I forget the exact context of why he mentioned this, but he said along the way in this big journey, and he's talking to people about these big challenges they have in their life, he said a little boy came up to him and was talking to this boy, and the boy said, little by little, the bird builds its nest. So little by little, the bird builds its nest, one twig at a time, one piece of straw, one piece of yarn, whatever the case is. And eventually, over time, the bird's got a full nest. And I just looked this up before I send it over to Jeremy in response, and it apparently is a French saying based on what I found. Its origin appears to be a French phrase, and I'm not even going to attempt the say it in French, but it's essentially, the literal translation is little by little the bird builds its nest, and kind of the meaning is every little bit counts and every little bit helps and builds onto the bigger picture. And so there's the joke, like the old wise man says, we are going to move that mountain right there. And the young kid in the village says, you're crazy. How are you possibly going to move that mountain? And the old wise villager says, one rock at a time, and that's the old saying. But so this is the concept, 1%, one little task, one thing at a time. And like, if you look at the whole thing, it is overwhelming. But if you look at the one task, like, okay, I can do that. So you may know, if you follow me on Twitter, I am a professional procrastinator, and one of the things that I am an expert procrastinator on is preparing for taxes, and as part of that, doing my bank recs. So I prefer to not do bank recs throughout the entire year. I prefer to choose the much more efficient method of doing 12 months of bank recs all at once over the course of 1 or 2 days. And I figure, hey, if I can do this in 8 hours, why waste my time doing a little bit each month throughout the year, right? I mean, the logic holds. Once I get in the groove, I can just bang out each month, and it's much more efficient, right? So my rationale goes. And so I just finished this, and if I would have just done a little bit at a time, I wouldn't be facing this mountain of reconciliations. And it turns out my old version of QuickBooks is no longer supported. I had to upgrade. So instead of being able to do my bank recs, I had to deal with upgrading. And I went from desktop to online, and it became this big mess. And I only just finished this nightmare last night. So kids, The lesson is little by little, right? So it's the 1% thing, right? So Jeremy knows a bit about this. He happens to have written a couple books now, and this is his most recent one, Business Central API Reference. And I can tell you that he was probably looking at this concept and the table of contents and thinking, whoa, this is a big project. And it is. It is a couple hundred pages. I forget the page count. It's 300 pages, I think. And it is going through detailed BC API, post requests, URLs, sample parameters, post response. He's basically doing the what is it? Swagger, Swashbuckle Swagger, the Swagger API automated endpoint thing, but he's having to do it manually and create a book out of it as a reference. So if you've ever used Swagger, then you know how awesome it is. And BC unfortunately doesn't have that currently, so he basically wrote the book that serves as our Swagger documentation of the BC API. And he's even included screenshots of the BC user interface. So on the purchase order page, where do you find the fields that relate to the API responses? Pretty big effort. Now, he didn't do all this at once in one fell swoop. Excuse me. But he very quickly pulled this together, so it seems, and he was able to assemble an entire reference guide on the BC endpoints. So another example is Francis Masangi. And I had an interview with him a while back on my YouTube channel. And he has done, I think, if I got it right, over 125 YouTube videos in the last year or so. And I mean, 125 videos in a year. Think of that. And like, wow, that's so much. I couldn't possibly do that. Well, he does one video at a time. He picks a topic, prepares a presentation, prepares a demo, and he does a video. He records it, posts it. And pretty soon, you do that a couple times a month. Before you know it, you've got 100 videos on YouTube, and you've really built up this library. In this I Need Coffee series, this is number 110. And I've done a bunch of other videos that are not numbered in this series, the Business Central Starting from Scratch. And pretty soon, you have more than 100, which is a pretty big number. In addition to doing videos, he's like, well, I want to teach a class, right? I want to teach people how to program AL and learn how to do development with BC. So he did a class over 30 days, an hour a day, one step at a time, right? Little by little. And so for $165, he offered a class where you can learn BC AL development. It's fantastic. And you may know that I am on a strange side journey into cybersecurity. And so I had no idea where to start. It's like, I don't know anything about this. How do I get oriented? So I've just been collecting notes for like over the last year. I'll need to check and see how long I've been doing it. But these are just pages from OneNote that I created. It's like, what about, hack the box type stuff? What resources are available there? So I started documenting that. It's like, okay, what learning resources are available? So anytime I come across a URL, a web page, a tweet, whatever, I paste it in there. What certifications can you get in cybersecurity? I now have a long list of certifications. What tools are available? What about security compliance? What about IPv6 security? What about password hashing, password cracking, Graylog SIM? It's just one topic after another, and I just create a new page and start slapping stuff in there. I don't quite understand a lot of it, but I'm starting to get oriented. It's like, okay, I know what a SIM is. I know what Yara and Sigma rules are. I know what API hacking as a topic relates to. I know red teaming and blue teaming. And so, well, how do I kind of move forward from here? Now that I've kind of got a lay in the land, where do I start to invest my time? So one of the training companies is called Anti-Siphon Training. And this company is owned and run by John Strand, who is a longtime cybersecurity expert, well known in the industry. Boy, this is fun. Got some edits for the podcast here. And I saw a tweet from them saying that he was going to be doing one of his training classes live. And he's a really busy guy, so it is not common that he can teach one of these classes live. So it's a pretty rare opportunity. So as soon as I saw the tweet a couple months ago, I signed up right away. And that training class is SOC Core Skills with John Strand. And SOC is Security Operations Center, one of the many, many acronyms I had to learn over the last year. And so this class teaches students what they would expect their employees to know if they were to work for their company, which is Black Hills Information System, I believe. So he has a separate security consulting company that has a security operations center. And so this is what he would expect students to know and be competent in order to start a job as an entry-level SOC analyst with his company. And so I said, hey, if he's teaching it, I signed up, and this was a pay what you can class. So many people didn't pay anything because they're students or they're in another country with different economic situations or whatever the case is. They're working part-time and trying to move into information security. And so I'm fortunate enough where I was able to pay the full class fee. It's relatively cheap compared to IT training courses. And so I was able to attend this 4-day class, getting started with BHIS SOC analyst, where he walks through a 4-day course about information security and cybersecurity. So this is fantastic. So I took notes of all 4 days, scrambling of screenshots and take notes and references and URLs and just slamming stuff into OneNote as this training is going on. And so it's like, wow, 4 days. Okay, that was a lot. And just that training, where do I go from there? And that's a giant pile. Like, what 1% do I pick out of that? Because there were talked about hundreds of topics during that class. And so one of the things he mentioned in the class and was referenced and discussed was something called WAZA. It's like, never heard of it. And it's like the old Budweiser ad or something where they say WAZA, if you're familiar with that, if you're old enough to remember those commercials in the US. And so I was like, what is this WAZA thing? And I looked into it, I was like, I don't know. And I looked into it more and I realized, whoa, this is pretty cool. It is a free open source, what's called an XDR and SIM. So it's like endpoint detection and response or extended detection and response for endpoints. And it has agents that aggregate all that endpoint logging into a centralized information and event management system or security information event management system called a SIM. And it gives you this dashboard. It's like, that sounds kind of interesting. So what did I do? I took my Sunday and said, well, let's try and install this Saturday and Sunday this weekend. And my graphics are a little out of order here, but it's called WAZA, and this is the end result. I was like, this is pretty cool. Well, that was the 1% from the 1%. So I took a class and I took one thing. There were 100 things I could have taken. I just chose this one, and I decided to install it. Well, what do you know? In under 2 hours, I had this up and running. It's really, really well designed. I thought it would be much more complex, but it went really well. Super impressive product. And it's free and open source, which is crazy. Very well designed. But it was all built on a pile of 1% learning that I'd done over the last 15 plus years. Building my own PCs because servers are expensive. Hosting is expensive. So I didn't have money 15 plus years ago. So I bought parts, built my own PC, and I've done that ever since. I just build a new server. Super cheap, high-end server, tons of RAM. So I have a dev server PC that I can use for anything. I know how to install and use Windows Server. I know how to use Hyper-V. I learned, I taught myself, I figured it out. I've been running Hyper-V for well over a decade. I've learned networking. I learned that in college, figured it out, did it in my dorm room, had an internship in New York with a trading firm, did network troubleshooting there as a help desk tech, right? So just learning. I've over the last year, I've learned how to install and configure Ubuntu server. I've learned about the versions 18, 20, 22. And I knew that, okay, Waza supports version 22. Cool, let me give that a try. Well, then to install agent, you got to know a little bit about PowerShell. It's like, okay, I know how to do PowerShell because of BC Container Helper and Business Central Docker containers. And I run Cylance as my endpoint protection. So I had to understand how to administer Cylance to kind of turn off the protections in order to run PowerShell, in order to run my agent, get the agent installed for Waza to report to the central SIM. Crazy, right? But this is all just 1%, one little thing at a time that just builds and builds and builds. And once I got it installed and I had this dashboard, I looked at this and I said, oh my gosh, is this what I think it is? Like, if you look at this screenshot of this dashboard, it probably wouldn't jump out for anyone who would be watching this, and I don't blame you, unless you're a super, super crazy geek like me about this kind of stuff. This would mean nothing to you. But you notice something in the bottom right corner? As soon as I saw that, I just was in utter disbelief. I was like, no way. This is crazy. Why? Because this was a prior 1% that I have been working on for the last couple of months. And this is the topic of Windows hardening. And so if you're familiar with Windows security, there's a concept called attack surface, and there's this long-standing process and concept of you have an OS, Windows, Linux, whatever, application, operating system, device, and you want to harden it in order to improve its security. This is an entire topic where you could spend years figuring out how to do this well. As part of the class, well, months before the class, I had been focusing on Windows hardening and trying to figure out what the current standards are for hardening Windows 10 in order to make it secure. I've been reading articles where very technical, seemingly competent people have been hacked because they had a misconfigured server, misconfigured OS, Windows, Linux, you name it. Everyone's been hacked. And these were not slouches, let's put it this way. These are people who are using PGP encryption. They're compiling their software from source, from GitHub. Like they think they're being super secure, but they made mistakes and they were not using hardened operating systems. So I went on a journey, how to harden Windows 10. And I've been looking at various resources. I didn't find anything good, but in the class, earlier in the class, I found, or it was mentioned by John, something called CIS benchmarking. Oh, what is that? Well, that is a company or organization called the Center for Internet Security that publishes these documents called CIS benchmarks. And these documents are very, very long, detailed documents on how to harden and lock down operating systems, applications, and devices. They have Windows, they have Linux, they have Oracle, they have Zoom. So you name it, not everything, but they have dozens of applications and operating systems. This Windows 10 Enterprise benchmark is over 1,300 pages. It talks about everything from, say, password policy to how to lock down certain ports and certain features. And this Windows 10 one has two levels. Level 1 is for enterprise, like kind of your typical enterprise application lockdown. Level 2 is for super secure environments that may break and will likely break functionality. So you won't be able to say, use fingerprint readers if you implement all their policies. So you have to be kind of careful about what you enable. So you see here, this is just a snapshot of the table of contents of this 1,300 page guide. Now, why was I excited when I saw this in Waza? Well, I was about to read through 1,300 pages or skim through to figure out, okay, what does this cover? How do you implement it? What's relevant for me? How do I sort this out? Another mountain, right, that I got to learn. And how do I start with what 1%? Well, as soon as I saw this in Waza, I had the epiphany. I connected another seemingly unrelated 1% of Windows hardening with the CIS benchmark here. And guess what? The Waza agent automatically runs a full CIS benchmark for Windows 10 or for your operating system. And this allows me to quickly see metrics on every single one of my agents or my workstations or laptops or whatever, servers, VMs. And it instantly showed me that I got 141 pass, 250 failed, 4 not applicable for a score of 36%. Now, what does that mean? No idea. Is that L1? Is that L2? How do I filter this? Some of these are irrelevant for sure, but it did the scan in seconds. I didn't have to read through 1,300 pages of the CIS benchmark. So this was just this crazy confluence of events and coincidences where when I saw what Waza did and this free agent that I installed in less than 2 hours, full configuration start to finish, my mind was blown. And this was a result of just these dozens of 1% activities accumulating and building upon each other for that effect, which I've already forgotten, the compounding effect of learning, right? So anyway, that's just a real world, very applicable to me story of how that 1%, just do the 1%. You won't know where it's going. It could be a hobby. It could be your work. It could be Business Central. It could be learning. It could be just something you enjoy doing. You just start to pursue it. You never know where it's going to pop out and suddenly be of interest, of value, and combine with some other thing to produce a synergistic effect, right? And so in this case, years of 1% in all sorts of random areas have combined to allow me to appreciate an automatic CIS benchmark by this free open source tool that runs on Ubuntu that I was able to install in 2 hours simply because I had all the background knowledge to make that happen. I'm by no means an expert, but I was able to follow the instructions and get this extraordinary value that this software is offering for free. So I'm now going to explore this, figure out, okay, what is this tool? What does it do? How do you use it? How do you configure it? And that's 101%. So it's going to take me months to try and figure out how can I leverage this and share this information. So with that, if it looks like there's a huge road ahead of you, hey, one step at a time, little by little, the bird builds its nest. Boy, that seems hard to say. So Jeremy mentions there's a book by Darren Hardy called The Compound Effect. Yeah, and oftentimes the 1% looks like nothing. It looks meaningless. And it's, in a financial compounding sense, you can see pennies pile up. In a learning or knowledge sense or skill sense, you may never see those pennies piling up because it's just kind of background knowledge that you really don't understand. But then one day you're like, someone says, hey, I don't know how to do this. And you're like, you're kidding me. Like, I know how to do that. I've been working on that for years as a hobby, and I never thought this would come into play, but it does. And on that day, it's really cool when it just suddenly becomes valuable. So with that, cheers. Have a good week. Go learn something and, try to figure out what that 1% is. If it's daily, that's fine. Weekly, monthly, whatever. Maybe do a training course a couple times a year. Maybe that'll be your 1%. Cheers.